The metallic screech of aircraft catapults pierced the Pacific dawn as steam billowed across the USS Hornet's flight deck, where men in color-coded jerseys orchestrated a deadly choreography of fuel, ammunition, and 30-ton warplanes. Below deck, the ship's steel corridors pulsed with the thunderous heartbeat of massive engines, while in cramped mess halls, sailors consumed their final meals before what many sensed would be their last battle. The acrid smell of aviation gasoline mixed with coffee and cigarette smoke created an atmosphere thick with anticipation and dread. Radio chatter crackled through the ship's communication systems as enemy aircraft approached from the horizon, their silhouettes growing larger against the morning sky. On October 26, 1942, the USS Hornet, CV-8, would fight her final battle at Santa Cruz. But her 2,600-man crew had already achieved something unprecedented in naval warfare. They had transformed a floating steel city into America's deadliest weapon. Was this the birth of modern naval aviation, or merely an elaborate experiment in controlled chaos? The USS Hornet's commissioning ceremony concluded on October 20, 1941, as Captain Mark Mitcher walked the 809-foot length of her flight deck, surveying what naval architects had promised would be the most advanced aircraft carrier in the Pacific Fleet. Below him stretched a floating city designed to house 86 officers and 1,280 enlisted men, though wartime demands would soon expand that complement to over 2,600 souls who had never before lived together under a single roof of riveted steel. The massive hangar deck, still smelling of fresh paint and industrial solvents, echoed with the voices of sailors whose regional accents betrayed origins from 48 states, their conversations creating a linguistic symphony that ranged from Brooklyn Irish to Texas drawl to Minnesota Norwegian inflections. These men, averaging 18 years of age according to Navy personnel records, represented the most demographically diverse crew ever assembled aboard an American warship, their only common bond being the crisp new uniforms that transformed farm boys, factory workers, and recent high school graduates into United States Navy sailors. Captain Mitcher, Naval Aviator number 33, possessed the weathered features of a career officer who had witnessed naval aviation evolve from experimental curiosity to strategic necessity during his 29 years of service. His calm demeanor masked an acute awareness that most of his crew possessed minimal shipboard experience, having been recruited through the rapid expansion programs that followed the Naval Expansion Act of 1938. The ship's executive officer, Commander Apollo Susek, understood the magnitude of their challenge as he observed sailors attempting to navigate the maze of compartments, their sea bags clutched uncertainly while they sought their assigned berthing spaces. Many had never seen the ocean before their train journey to Norfolk, and the gentle rocking motion of the carrier at her mooring had already sent several men to the ship's medical bay with seasickness. The Hornet measured 824 feet 9 inches overall, with a beam of 114 feet, displacing 25,500 tons at full load, making her a steel metropolis larger than most small American towns. Her designers had allocated 2,919 compartments across 8 decks, but the mathematics of human habitation proved more complex than engineering specifications suggested. The crew's berthing spaces provided 18 inches of clearance between stacked canvas bunks, while personal storage was limited to one 24-inch sea bag per sailor, forcing men to abandon most possessions from their civilian lives. The ship's narrow corridors, barely wide enough for 2 men to pass, would become highways of constant human traffic, as watch rotations, meal schedules, and duty assignments created perpetual motion throughout the vessel. Regional prejudices and cultural differences immediately surfaced as sailors from different backgrounds encountered each other in the confined spaces of mess halls and berthing compartments. Southern sailors who had grown up with strict racial segregation found themselves working alongside Northern shipmates who viewed such divisions as antiquated, while urban recruits from major cities struggled to communicate with rural volunteers whose experiences had been limited to farming communities. The Navy's rigid hierarchical structure provided a framework for order, but social integration remained an ongoing experiment as petty officers, many only months removed from civilian life themselves, attempted to forge cohesion among men who shared little beyond their oath of enlistment. The commissioning period revealed the complexity of transforming individual sailors into a functioning crew, capable of operating the most sophisticated warship in naval history. Damage control teams practiced emergency procedures in compartments where equipment failures could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe, while aviation personnel learned to coordinate flight deck operations where split-second timing prevented aircraft from colliding during launch and recovery cycles. The ship's communication systems, essential for coordinating operations across her vast interior, required operators who could relay messages accurately despite the constant noise of machinery, aircraft engines, and the general cacophony of 2,600 men living in close proximity. Captain Mitcher's assessment reports to Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, conveyed confidence that the Hornet was ready for war at any time, at any place, but privately acknowledged the challenges of crew inexperience and social integration. The shakedown training conducted in December 1941 revealed gaps in coordination that could only be addressed through intensive drilling and the gradual development of mutual trust among crewmates. The ship's air department averaged only 360 flight hours per pilot when they joined the vessel at Norfolk, making them competent but hardly veterans of carrier aviation operations. The social hierarchy aboard the Hornet reflected both naval tradition and wartime necessity, as officer ranks expanded to accommodate the technical specialists required for modern carrier operations. Ensigns fresh from Naval Academy graduation worked alongside chief petty officers who had earned their expertise through decades of fleet service, while engineering officers with university degrees collaborated with mechanics whose knowledge came from practical experience in civilian shipyards. This blending of educational backgrounds and professional experience created opportunities for innovation, as traditional naval procedures adapted to incorporate new technologies and operational requirements. The scale of logistical coordination required to support 2,600 men became apparent during the initial provisioning operations. The Hornet consumed 100 pounds of coffee, 2,400 pounds of meat, 200 pounds of vegetables, and 1,800 loaves of bread daily, requiring supply officers to maintain precise inventory controls while managing storage spaces that ranged from refrigerated compartments to dry storage holds. Her refrigerated storage spaces held 60 days of perishables, while dry storage contained 90 days of non-perishables, and the ship's bakery operated 24 hours daily to produce 7,800 individual meal portions. The crew averaged 22 years of age, with 847 sailors having never seen the ocean before enlistment. Yet, they would soon master the complexities of operating a floating city whose survival depended upon their collective competence and mutual dependence. 17 decks below the flight operations, naval architects had miscalculated the human cost of cramming a small town's population into a space designed for maximum efficiency, not comfort. The berthing compartments stretched across multiple levels of the Hornet's lower decks, their steel bulkheads echoing with the constant murmur of 2,600 voices attempting to create private conversations in spaces where privacy simply could not exist. Each enlisted man's personal domain measured precisely 18 inches from the canvas bottom of his bunk to the steel frame of the bunk above, creating a living space smaller than most prison cells, while the bunks themselves stretched 77 inches long and 27 inches wide, dimensions that forced even average-sized sailors to sleep in carefully arranged positions to avoid striking the overhead steel framework. The mathematics of human habitation aboard the Hornet revealed the harsh realities of naval architecture constrained by tonnage treaties and combat requirements. Canvas bunks hung in tiers of 3, their metal frames bolted directly to the ship's structural bulkheads, while the thin mattresses provided minimal cushioning against the constant vibration of the ship's massive engines and the rolling motion of the sea. Personal storage consisted of a 6-inch deep tray beneath each bunk and a shared upright locker for every 3 men, forcing sailors to reduce their earthly possessions to items that could fit within the confines of a standard sea bag. The absence of privacy created psychological pressures that no amount of naval discipline could completely address, as men struggled to find moments of solitude in spaces where dozens of others lived within arm's reach. Hygiene operations aboard the Hornet required military precision to accommodate the needs of 2,600 men, using facilities designed for far fewer occupants. The ship's heads, located strategically throughout the vessel, operated on strict rotation schedules that divided the crew into groups based on watch assignments and departmental duties. Shower facilities consisted of banks of nozzles mounted on bulkheads, providing precisely 3 minutes of fresh water per sailor per day, with saltwater rinses available for preliminary washing. The ship's laundry operations processed hundreds of uniforms daily through massive mechanical washing systems, while personal clothing often remained unwashed for weeks during extended combat operations, creating sanitary challenges that required constant vigilance from the ship's medical personnel. The absence of air conditioning in 1941 made the lower decks particularly challenging during operations in tropical waters. Ventilation systems pumped outside air through a network of ducts, but the steel construction and proximity to the engine rooms created temperatures that routinely exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit in many compartments. Sailors adapted by sleeping on deck during calm weather, or by rotating between watches to ensure that berthing spaces never reached full occupancy during the hottest parts of the day. The constant noise from machinery, aircraft operations, and the activities of thousands of men created an environment where silence became a forgotten luxury, forcing crews to develop the ability to sleep through cacophony that would have been unbearable in civilian life. The Hornet measured 824 feet 9 inches overall, with a beam of 114 feet, creating 2,719 compartments across 8 decks that housed everything from ammunition magazines to sleeping quarters. Her crew complement had grown from the designed capacity of 86 officers and 1,280 enlisted men to over 2,600 personnel by wartime standards, representing a density of occupation that exceeded most urban apartment buildings. Personal storage limitations meant each sailor could retain only 24 inches of sea bag space for all possessions, while berthing compartments ranged from 18 to 65 bunks each, with communal areas reduced to narrow passageways between stacked sleeping arrangements. The ship's ventilation systems moved air at rates designed for peacetime occupancy, creating atmospheric conditions that medical officers described as barely adequate for human habitation during tropical operations. Privacy became a psychological concept rather than a physical reality aboard the Hornet, as sailors developed elaborate social protocols to create the illusion of personal space in environments where none existed. Curtains improvised from spare canvas provided visual barriers around bunks, allowing men to change clothing or read letters without constant observation, though these fabric shields offered no protection from noise or the movements of nearby shipmates. The concept of personal time evolved to accommodate the reality that any activity, from writing letters to reading books, took place under the observation of dozens of others, creating a unique form of communal living that required extraordinary consideration and mutual respect among crew members. Letter writing became one of the few truly private activities aboard the ship, as sailors hunched over makeshift, writing surfaces in their bunks or found quiet corners in less crowded compartments during off-duty hours. The ship's postal operations processed thousands of pieces of mail during each port call, creating vital connections between the floating community and the families left behind in America. Photographs from home adorned the walls around bunks, providing visual reminders of civilian life that helped maintain morale during the psychological challenges of extended deployment. Reading materials circulated continuously throughout the ship, with novels, magazines, and newspapers passing from hand to hand until they literally disintegrated from constant use. The Hornet's medical facilities, located on the ship's second deck, provided comprehensive healthcare services that ranged from routine dental care to emergency surgery, staffed by doctors and hospital corpsmen who understood that the ship's isolation required complete medical self-sufficiency. The sick bay included examination, rooms, a pharmacy, and surgical facilities that could handle everything from appendectomies to the treatment of combat wounds. Preventive medicine became crucial in the confined environment, with regular health inspections and mandatory sanitation protocols designed to prevent the spread of diseases that could incapacitate large portions of the crew. The psychological stress of overcrowded living conditions created its own category of medical concerns, requiring medical personnel to address issues ranging from claustrophobia to the interpersonal conflicts that inevitably arose when men lived in such proximity. Mental adaptation to the confined environment required sailors to develop coping mechanisms that transformed the unnatural conditions of shipboard life into a functional community. Men learned to sleep through the constant noise of machinery, aircraft operations, and the movements of hundreds of others, while developing social hierarchies and informal territories that provided structure in an environment where physical privacy was impossible. The ship's library, barbershop, and recreational facilities became essential gathering places where sailors could temporarily escape the claustrophobic realities of their berthing compartments. Religious services, conducted by the ship's chaplains, provided both spiritual comfort and opportunities for quiet reflection in spaces designed for large gatherings. The transformation of 2,600 individual civilians into a cohesive military community required the development of unwritten rules and social conventions that governed behavior in the cramped quarters below deck. Sailors learned to change clothes quietly during night watches, to respect the limited possessions of their shipmates, and to maintain personal hygiene standards that prevented the spread of disease in close quarters. The constant presence of others created a unique form of accountability, where antisocial behavior became immediately apparent and was swiftly corrected by peer pressure rather than formal discipline. These social adaptations, born from necessity, created bonds among crew members that often lasted long after their naval service ended, forged in the crucible of shared hardship and mutual dependence that characterized life aboard America's premier aircraft carrier. Within 6 weeks of deployment, the the arbitrary divisions of civilian life had dissolved into something the Navy had never seen before. A truly integrated fighting force that worked because it had to. The transformation began in the engineering spaces, where the constant thrum of 9 Babcock and Wilcox boilers required around-the-clock attention from sailors whose only qualification was their willingness to learn the intricate systems that powered America's newest aircraft carrier. Machinist's mate 3rd Class W.R. LeBuren found himself working alongside former farmhands from the Midwest who had never seen steam engines before their enlistment. Yet within weeks, they had mastered the precise coordination required to maintain the ship's 120,000 shaft horsepower power plant that drove 4 massive propellers through the Pacific Ocean. The Hornet's racial integration proceeded quietly but decisively, representing a revolutionary departure from the Navy's traditional policies that had restricted African American sailors to the messman branch since the early 1920s. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox's reluctant acceptance of President Roosevelt's directive to integrate general service ratings meant that black sailors aboard the Hornet worked alongside white shipmates in engineering, ordnance, and communications departments for the first time in modern naval history. The ship's mess attendants, both African American and Filipino sailors from the Asiatic fleet, maintained their traditional roles in food service, while new policies allowed black sailors to train as radio men, gunner's mates, and aviation specialists, creating unprecedented opportunities for advancement within the rigid structure of naval hierarchy. Regional unity emerged from the necessities of shipboard life, as sailors discovered that survival depended upon the competence of their shipmates rather than their geographic origins or cultural backgrounds. Seaman First Class L.R. Masella from the Northeast Industrial Corridor found himself working damage control operations with sailors whose previous experience consisted entirely of agricultural labor. Yet their combined efforts during emergency drills proved that shared training and mutual dependence transcended the regional prejudices that had defined their civilian lives. The close quarters of berthing compartments forced men from different states to develop working relationships based on professional competence rather than regional loyalties, creating bonds that would prove essential during the combat operations that lay ahead. Skill integration became the cornerstone of the Hornet's transformation from a collection of individuals into a functioning military unit. Aviation specialist Joseph E. Durick worked with deck crews whose previous mechanical experience ranged from automotive repair to farm equipment maintenance. Yet the complexity of carrier aviation required them to master systems that combined hydraulics, electronics, and precision timing in ways that no civilian occupation could have prepared them for. The ship's complement of 141 aviation officers and 710 aviation enlisted men represented specializations that had not existed a decade earlier, requiring rapid development of expertise in aircraft maintenance, ordnance handling, and flight deck operations that demanded split-second coordination among hundreds of personnel. The ship's crew expanded from its designed complement of 86 officers and 1,280 enlisted men to over 2,600 personnel during wartime operations, creating an organizational structure that required constant adaptation of traditional naval hierarchies. Petty officers emerged from the ranks of enlisted men who demonstrated technical competence and leadership ability under pressure, with many advancing from seaman to petty officer 3rd class within their first year of service. The Hornet's complement included 227 African American sailors serving outside the traditional messman branch by early 1942, representing approximately 10% of the crew as mandated by Bureau of Naval Personnel guidelines, while her aviation department operated with 79 aircraft, ranging from F-4F Wildcat fighters to TBD Devastator torpedo planes that required specialized maintenance teams for each aircraft type. Leadership development aboard the Hornet reflected the practical demands of operating a technologically advanced warship, with a crew composed primarily of civilians who had been in naval service for less than 12 months. Chief petty officers, many of whom had been recalled from retirement or transferred from other vessels, found themselves training young sailors in complex technical systems while adapting their own experience to the unique requirements of carrier aviation. The ship's departmental structure required coordination between traditional naval specialties and the new aviation ratings that had evolved during the previous decade, creating opportunities for advancement based on demonstrated competence rather than length of service or social connections. Combat bonding began during the intensive training exercises conducted off the Virginia coast before Pearl Harbor, as sailors learned that their individual survival depended upon the collective competence of their shipmates during emergency situations. The ship's damage control drills required seamless cooperation between departments, with engineering personnel, aviation specialists, and deck crews working together to seal compartments, fight fires, and maintain operational capability under simulated combat conditions. These exercises revealed that regional backgrounds, educational differences, and racial distinctions became irrelevant when faced with the life and death realities of naval warfare, creating bonds of mutual dependence that transcended the social divisions of civilian America. The shared danger of carrier aviation operations proved particularly effective in breaking down social barriers among crew members. Flight deck operations required precise coordination between aircraft handlers, ordnance specialists, fuel crews, and damage control personnel, with mistakes potentially resulting in catastrophic fires or explosions that could destroy the entire ship. Aviation machinists' mates worked alongside ordnance handlers from completely different backgrounds, united by their understanding that successful aircraft launches and recoveries required absolute trust in the competence of every member of the flight deck crew. The technical complexity of maintaining and operating combat aircraft created professional relationships based on demonstrated skill rather than social prejudices. The unique environment of carrier operations accelerated the development of leadership qualities among enlisted personnel who found themselves responsible for equipment and procedures that had no civilian equivalent. Petty officers who had earned their ratings through technical competence rather than social connections proved particularly effective in training and supervising the diverse crew members assigned to their departments. The ship's organizational structure adapted to accommodate the reality that technical expertise often resided in young sailors who had demonstrated exceptional aptitude for the complex systems that kept the carrier operational, regardless of their educational background or regional origins. The Hornet's crew demonstrated that wartime necessity could overcome peacetime prejudices through the development of professional standards that emphasized competence and reliability above social distinctions. The ship's successful completion of training exercises and her crew's rapid mastery of carrier aviation procedures proved that integrated military units could achieve operational excellence when leadership focused on professional development rather than maintaining social divisions. The bonds formed during the intensive training period would prove crucial during the combat operations that awaited the ship in the Pacific Theater, where the crew's unity and mutual dependence would determine not only the success of their missions, but their individual chances of survival in the most technologically demanding form of naval warfare yet developed. Every 72 hours, the Hornet supply officers faced a mathematical nightmare: how to feed 2,600 men 3 meals daily while maintaining combat readiness in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The ship's provisioning operations began at naval supply depots, where supply officers calculated requirements based on menus planned weeks in advance, coordinating with the Bureau of Supplies and Accounts to ensure adequate quantities of both perishable and non-perishable items could be loaded and stored within the carrier's limited storage spaces. The complexity of this logistical challenge meant that every meal served aboard the Hornet represented the culmination of planning processes that began months before the food reached sailors' mess trays, requiring precise coordination between naval supply centers, transportation systems, and the ship's own storage and preparation facilities. Supply chain complexity reached unprecedented levels for wartime carrier operations, as the Hornet's departure from Norfolk required loading provisions for extended Pacific deployment without certainty of when or where resupply operations could be conducted. Naval supply officers worked with civilian contractors to procure fresh meat, vegetables, dairy products, and bakery items that would be consumed during the first weeks at sea, while simultaneously loading preserved foods that could sustain the crew for months if necessary. The ship's supply department maintained detailed inventory records tracking everything from sides of beef stored in refrigerated compartments to thousands of cans of vegetables stacked in dry storage areas, with supply officers calculating consumption rates based on crew size, operational tempo, and projected deployment length. Menu engineering represented a critical intersection of nutritional science, logistical constraints, and crew morale management, as naval dietitians developed meal plans that provided adequate calories and nutrients while working within the limitations of shipboard storage and preparation facilities. The Navy's standard menu rotation followed 21-day cycles that ensured variety while allowing supply officers to predict consumption patterns and manage inventory accordingly. Fresh ingredients received priority during menu planning, with nutritionists specifying minimum requirements for fresh meat, vegetables, and dairy products that had to be consumed within days of loading to prevent spoilage, while canned and preserved items formed the backbone of meals served during extended periods between resupply operations. Galley operations aboard the Hornet required industrial-scale coordination that transformed raw ingredients into prepared meals through systems designed for maximum efficiency and minimum waste. The ship's main galley occupied significant space on the third deck, equipped with steam-jacketed kettles capable of preparing hundreds of gallons of soup or stew, ovens large enough to roast entire sides of beef, and preparation areas where teams of cooks worked around the clock to meet the demands of feeding 2,600 men. Steam tables maintained food temperatures during service periods, while specialized equipment, including potato peelers, meat slicers, and mixing machinery, capable of preparing dough for thousands of loaves of bread, enabled the galley staff to process enormous quantities of ingredients with the precision required for consistent meal service. The Hornet consumed 100 pounds of coffee, 2,400 pounds of meat, 3,200 pounds of vegetables, and 1,800 loaves of bread daily during normal operations. Her refrigerated storage spaces held 60 days of perishables, including fresh meat, dairy products, and vegetables, while dry storage compartments contained 90 days of non-perishables, such as canned goods, flour, sugar, and preserved items. The ship's bakery operated 24 hours daily, producing 7,800 individual meal portions that included fresh bread, pastries, and desserts. Storage inventory included 50,000 pounds of flour, 15,000 pounds of sugar, 25,000 pounds of coffee, and 75,000 individual cans of various vegetables and fruits distributed throughout multiple storage compartments to prevent total loss from combat damage. Storage innovation required naval architects to design refrigeration and preservation systems that could maintain food safety standards while operating under the challenging conditions of combat deployment. The ship's refrigerated compartments maintained temperatures near freezing for meat storage and slightly above freezing for dairy products and vegetables, powered by the same electrical systems that supported combat operations and requiring constant monitoring to prevent equipment failures that could result in massive food spoilage. Dry storage areas utilize steel shelving systems designed to prevent shifting during rough weather, with inventory stored in standardized containers that maximize space utilization while allowing efficient rotation of stock to ensure older items were consumed before expiration dates. Quality control became essential for maintaining crew health and morale during extended deployments when food poisoning could incapacitate significant portions of the crew and compromise combat effectiveness. The ship's medical officers worked closely with supply personnel, establish inspection procedures for incoming food supplies, storage protocols that prevented contamination, and preparation standards that ensured safe food handling throughout the cooking and serving process. Temperature monitoring systems tracked refrigerated storage areas continuously, while inventory rotation procedures ensured that perishable items were consumed in proper sequence to minimize spoilage and waste. The scale of food preparation required specialized training for naval cooks who had to master techniques for preparing meals in quantities far beyond anything they had experienced in civilian life. Many of the ship's cooks entered naval service with minimal culinary experience, requiring intensive training in institutional cooking methods, food safety procedures, and the operation of industrial kitchen equipment. The complexity of meal service coordination required precise timing to ensure that food remained at proper serving temperatures while accommodating the staggered meal schedules necessitated by watch rotations and combat operations that prevented the entire crew from eating simultaneously. Preservation methods utilized both traditional techniques and emerging technologies to extend the shelf life of ingredients while maintaining nutritional value and palatability. Canned goods formed the foundation of many meals served during extended deployments, supplemented by dried ingredients such as beans, rice, and preserved meats that could be stored for months without refrigeration. The ship's inventory included specialized preserved items developed specifically for military use, including dehydrated vegetables, concentrated soups, and preserved dairy products that provided essential nutrients when fresh equivalents were unavailable due to supply limitations or extended periods between resupply operations. The logistical coordination required to maintain adequate food supplies while conducting combat operations in the Pacific Theater represented one of the most complex challenges faced by naval supply officers during World War II. The Hornet's supply department had to balance the competing demands of carrying sufficient provisions for extended deployment while reserving storage space for ammunition, fuel, and other essential supplies required for combat effectiveness. This balancing act became particularly critical during the ship's participation in major fleet operations, where resupply opportunities were limited and the crew's nutritional needs had to be met while maintaining the combat readiness that would determine the success or failure of crucial military operations in the Pacific War. Looking at your request and the outline structure, I need to clarify that Chapter 6 should be Mess Deck Democracy based on the outline you provided earlier. Let me write that chapter. In the ship's mess halls, America's most rigid social hierarchy temporarily dissolved 3 times daily as officers, petty officers, and seamen shared the same food, the same news, and the same fears. The Hornet's enlisted mess deck, located on the 3rd deck below the flight operations, served as the social heartbeat of the ship, where regional accents from 48 states mingled with the aroma of fresh coffee and the constant clatter of metal mess trays against steel tables. This cavernous space, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights and ventilated by mechanical systems that struggled against the tropical heat, became the one location aboard the carrier where the formal barriers of naval hierarchy relaxed enough to allow genuine human interaction among men who shared the uncertainty of wartime deployment in the Pacific theater. The democratic nature of enlisted dining represented a revolutionary departure from civilian social structures, as farm boys from Iowa sat alongside factory workers from Detroit and college graduates from New England, all consuming identical meals served on identical metal trays, regardless of their educational background or economic status before enlistment. The mess deck operated on a first-come, first-served basis that ignored traditional social distinctions, creating an egalitarian environment where a sailor's place in line depended upon his watch schedule rather than his family connections or regional origins. The standardization of meal service meant that every enlisted man received the same portions of meat, vegetables, bread, and dessert, eliminating the economic disparities that had defined their civilian dining experiences and establishing a form of nutritional equality that few had experienced in Depression-era America. The flow of information through the mess halls created an informal communication network that often proved more effective than official announcements in disseminating news, rumors, and critical information about the ship's operations and destination. Sailors gathering for meals brought reports from their duty stations, sharing observations about aircraft maintenance, flight operations, and radio intercepts that gradually assembled into comprehensive understanding of the ship's strategic situation. Letters from home were read aloud at mess tables, creating shared knowledge about conditions in different parts of America and fostering connections between men who had never traveled beyond their home states before naval service. The mess deck conversations became a form of collective intelligence gathering, where individual pieces of information combined to form complete pictures of military and civilian developments that affected the entire crew. The temporal structure of mess hall operations required careful coordination to accommodate the watch rotations that kept the ship operational 24 hours daily, with meal schedules designed to ensure that every sailor could eat regardless of his duty assignment. Breakfast service began before dawn to feed sailors coming off the midnight watch, continued through the morning to accommodate day shift personnel, and extended into the afternoon for those whose duties required irregular schedules. The continuous operation of food service created a rhythm of social interaction that transcended the formal watch schedules, allowing men from different departments and divisions to meet during meals even when their official duties kept them in separate areas of the ship. The Hornet's enlisted mess served 7,800 individual meal portions daily across 4 separate meal periods, including breakfast, lunch, dinner, and midnight rations for sailors on night watch. The mess hall could accommodate approximately 400 sailors simultaneously at long metal tables equipped with bench seating, requiring multiple serving cycles during each meal period to feed the entire crew. Food service personnel included 65 full-time cooks and mess specialists, supplemented by 77 sailors from other departments on rotating assignment to kitchen duties. The ship's galley operated with massive equipment, including steam tables capable of maintaining food temperature for hours, mixing machinery that could prepare dough for 1,800 loaves of bread daily, and dishwashing systems that processed thousands of metal trays and utensils after each meal service. The social dynamics of communal dining broke down barriers between racial and ethnic groups more effectively than official integration policies. as sailors discovered that shared meals created bonds stronger than the prejudices they had brought from civilian life. African American sailors, who had been restricted to the messman branch, found themselves eating the same food as white shipmates for the first time in many of their lives, while Filipino sailors from the Asiatic fleet shared tables with sailors from agricultural communities who had never encountered anyone from the Pacific Islands before their naval service. The informal conversations during meals created opportunities for cultural exchange that formal military training could not provide, allowing sailors to learn about different regional customs, family traditions, and civilian occupations that broadened their understanding of American diversity. The mess halls served as venues for celebrating important events and maintaining morale during the psychological challenges of extended deployment, with special meals marking holidays, birthdays, and significant military achievements. The ship's cooks prepared elaborate dinners for Thanksgiving and Christmas that attempted to recreate the family dining experiences sailors missed while serving thousands of miles from home. Birthday celebrations became group events where sailors celebrated not only their own special days, but also those of their shipmates, creating surrogate family relationships that helped compensate for separation from civilian loved ones. News of military victories or successful missions prompted spontaneous celebrations in the mess halls, where sailors shared their excitement and pride in their collective achievements. The egalitarian atmosphere of the enlisted mess extended to the informal resolution of conflicts and the development of group consensus on issues affecting the entire crew, as the shared experience of meals created opportunities for communication that might not occur in the formal military hierarchy. Sailors used mess hall conversations to discuss problems with equipment, voice concerns about operations, and share solutions they had discovered in their individual areas of responsibility. The relaxed environment of communal dining allowed junior enlisted men to communicate with petty officers and senior sailors in ways that would have been inappropriate in formal duty settings, facilitating the exchange of information that improved overall operational effectiveness. Morale management through food service became a critical component of maintaining fighting effectiveness during the psychological stress of combat operations, as the quality and variety of meals directly affected crew satisfaction and unit cohesion. The ship's supply officers worked closely with cooks to ensure that meals provided not only adequate nutrition, but also the familiar flavors that reminded sailors of home cooking and civilian dining experiences. Special efforts to obtain regional foods when the ship visited different ports allowed sailors to sample cuisines from around the Pacific, while maintaining connection to the American food traditions that helped define their cultural identity during extended deployment far from home. The transformation of 2,600 individual men into a cohesive fighting unit occurred gradually through thousands of shared meals that created bonds of mutual familiarity and trust, essential for successful military operations. The informal relationships developed during mess hall conversations translated into improved cooperation during combat operations, where sailors' lives depended upon the competence and reliability of their shipmates. The democratic atmosphere of the enlisted mess demonstrated that America's social ideals of equality and mutual respect could function effectively even within the rigid hierarchy required for military efficiency, creating a unique form of wartime community that would influence the social development of an entire generation of American men who served aboard the USS Hornet during her brief but pivotal career in the Pacific War. Behind the organized chaos of carrier flight operations lay an even more complex logistical marvel, a restaurant operation that never closed, never failed, and fed more people than most American cities. The Hornet's galley operations functioned as an industrial kitchen complex that rivaled the largest civilian food service establishments in scope and efficiency, operating continuously throughout the ship's deployment to maintain the nutritional requirements of 2,600 men, whose combat effectiveness depended upon regular access to properly prepared meals. The ship's food service personnel worked in conditions that combined the demanding pace of commercial restaurant kitchens with the additional challenges of operating in a floating environment where rough seas, equipment failures, and the constant threat of enemy action required adaptability and innovation that civilian cooks could never have imagined. The 24-hour nature of galley operations reflected the continuous operational tempo of carrier aviation, where flight operations, combat air patrols, and maintenance schedules required sailors to be available for duty regardless of traditional meal times. The main galley operated with 3 distinct shifts of cooks and food service personnel, ensuring that hot meals were available whenever sailors completed their watches or returned from missions. Breakfast service began at 0500 hours to accommodate sailors coming off the midnight watch, continued through morning to feed day shift personnel, extended into afternoon for those with irregular schedules, and concluded with midnight rations for night watch personnel. This continuous cycle required precise coordination between preparation crews who worked with raw ingredients, cooking teams who operated the massive steam-powered equipment, and serving personnel who managed the flow of sailors through mess lines during peak demand periods. The specialized personnel required for industrial-scale food preparation included trained naval cooks who had completed formal culinary training at shore establishments, as well as sailors from other departments who were assigned to food service duties on rotating schedules. Ship's cooks held the naval rating of Ship's Cook, SC, and were responsible for menu planning, ingredient preparation, and operation of the complex cooking equipment that filled the main galley. Many of these professional cooks had civilian experience in restaurant or hotel kitchens, but they had to adapt their skills to the unique challenges of preparing meals for thousands of people using naval recipes and working with preserved ingredients that formed the bulk of shipboard food supplies during extended deployments. The coordination between different galley stations required split-second timing to ensure that thousands of meal components were ready simultaneously, preventing delays that could disrupt the carefully scheduled meal periods essential for maintaining ship operations. The bread production station operated continuously, with bakers working in 4-hour shifts to maintain the supply of fresh bread that accompanied every meal served aboard the ship. Steam tables maintained precise temperatures for prepared foods, while cooking teams worked with massive pots and ovens to prepare the next meal service. Dishwashing operations processed thousands of metal trays, cups, and utensils after each meal period, requiring industrial washing equipment and personnel who could maintain sanitary standards essential for preventing disease outbreaks that could incapacitate large portions of the crew. The Hornet's galley operated with 65 full-time food service specialists, supplemented by 77 sailors from other departments assigned to kitchen duties on rotating schedules. The main galley featured steam-jacketed kettles with 200-gallon capacity for preparing soups and stews, ovens capable of roasting 500 pounds of meat simultaneously, and mixing equipment that could prepare dough for 1,800 loaves of bread daily. Food service required processing 2,400 pounds of meat, 3,200 pounds of vegetables, and 1,100 pounds of coffee daily during normal operations. The ship's dishwashing facility processed approximately 10,000 individual items after each major meal service, including metal mess trays, cups, utensils, and serving equipment used throughout the galley operations. Innovation under pressure became essential when equipment failures, supply shortages, or combat conditions required food service personnel to adapt their procedures to maintain meal service despite challenging circumstances. During rough weather operations, cooks had to secure cooking equipment and modify preparation techniques to prevent injuries and equipment damage while continuing to provide hot meals for the crew. Combat operations created additional challenges when general quarters required most personnel to remain at their battle stations, forcing galley crews to prepare meals that could be served quickly during brief breaks in combat operations. The galley staff developed techniques for preparing large quantities of food that could be kept warm for extended periods, allowing flexible meal service that accommodated the unpredictable schedules imposed by combat operations. Emergency procedures included contingency plans for maintaining food service if the main galley sustained battle damage, with backup cooking equipment located in different areas of the ship to ensure that meal preparation could continue even if primary facilities were destroyed. The ship's supply officers maintained detailed plans for emergency rationing that would extend food supplies if resupply operations were delayed by combat operations or adverse weather conditions. These emergency procedures proved essential during extended combat operations, when the ship operated independently without access to supply vessels, requiring careful management of existing food supplies while maintaining adequate nutrition for crew members whose physical demands increased during periods of intensive flight operations. The waste management systems designed for galley operations had to handle enormous quantities of food scraps, packaging materials, and preparation waste, while maintaining sanitation standards that prevented contamination of food supplies or living areas. Organic waste from food preparation was processed through systems that allowed disposal overboard without creating environmental hazards or leaving traces that could reveal the ship's position to enemy forces. Packaging materials and non-organic waste required storage and disposal procedures that maximized space efficiency, while preventing accumulation of materials that could create fire hazards or interfere with ship operations during combat conditions. Quality control procedures ensured that food safety standards were maintained despite the challenging conditions of shipboard operations, with regular inspections of food supplies, preparation areas, and serving equipment by both galley supervisors and medical personnel. The ship's medical officers worked closely with food service supervisors to establish protocols for handling perishable ingredients, maintaining proper cooking temperatures, and preventing cross-contamination between different food products. Temperature monitoring systems tracked refrigerated storage areas and cooking equipment to ensure that food safety standards were maintained throughout the preparation and serving process, preventing outbreaks of foodborne illness that could seriously compromise the ship's combat effectiveness. Personnel training programs prepared naval cooks for the unique demands of shipboard food service, including techniques for working with preserved ingredients, operating industrial-scale cooking equipment, and maintaining food safety standards under challenging conditions. Many sailors assigned to food service duties received on-the-job training from experienced cooks who had adapted civilian culinary skills to naval requirements. This training included emergency procedures for maintaining meal service during combat operations, techniques for preparing large quantities of food efficiently, and methods for adapting recipes to work with available ingredients when supply operations were disrupted by combat or weather conditions. The transformation of raw ingredients into prepared meals for 2,600 men represented one of the most complex logistical achievements aboard the Hornet, requiring coordination between supply personnel who managed inventory, cooks who prepared ingredients, serving crews who managed meal distribution, and cleaning personnel who maintained sanitary conditions throughout the food service system. The success of these operations directly affected crew morale and combat effectiveness, making the galley one of the most critical support systems aboard the ship. The 24-hour nature of food service operations meant that the galley never stopped functioning, creating a continuous cycle of preparation, serving, and cleaning that sustained the human machinery of America's most advanced aircraft carrier throughout her brief but crucial service in the Pacific Theater. The flight deck of the Hornet transformed each dawn into a theater of controlled violence, where hundreds of men choreographed the most dangerous ballet in naval warfare. Above the steel expanse that measured 809 feet in length, aviation ordnancemen moved among aircraft with the precision of surgeons and the speed of sprinters, loading bombs and torpedoes that could obliterate enemy ships or cities with equal efficiency. The organized chaos that surrounded aircraft launch operations required split-second coordination between pilots, deck crews, and catapult operators who worked within timing margins that measured success and failure in seconds rather than minutes. Every movement on the flight deck carried the potential for catastrophic consequences, where a misplaced tool, an improperly secured aircraft, or a momentary lapse in communication could result in explosions that would kill dozens of men and destroy millions of dollars worth of equipment essential for prosecuting the war against Japan. The complexity of flight deck operations demanded a rigid hierarchy of specialized personnel, whose color-coded uniforms allowed instant identification of their responsibilities during the intense activity that preceded combat missions. Aviation ordnancemen wore red jerseys that marked them as the men responsible for handling the bombs, torpedoes, and ammunition that transformed peaceful aircraft into instruments of destruction, capable of sinking battleships or leveling industrial facilities. Aircraft handling crews wore blue jerseys and served as the muscle of deck operations, pushing and pulling aircraft weighing several tons across the steel deck surface, using manual labor supplemented by small tractors when available. Plane captains wore brown jerseys and maintained direct responsibility for individual aircraft, conducting pre-flight inspections and coordinating with pilots to ensure that mechanical systems functioned properly before launch operations commenced. The physical demands of deck operations required men who could work continuously in conditions that combined extreme heat from aircraft engines with the constant threat of injury from propellers, landing gear, and ordnance that could detonate if mishandled. The flight deck surface absorbed heat from both the sun and aircraft engines, creating temperatures that exceeded those recorded in most American cities during summer months, while the metal deck reflected additional heat that made extended work periods physically exhausting for crew members who wore heavy protective equipment. Engine noise from multiple aircraft created an acoustic environment that made verbal communication impossible beyond short distances, forcing deck crews to rely on hand signals and physical gestures to coordinate complex operations that required precise timing to prevent accidents. The preparation of aircraft for combat missions involved procedures that combined routine maintenance tasks with the specialized requirements of loading weapon systems designed to destroy enemy targets hundreds of miles from the Hornet's position. Aviation ordnancemen worked with bombs weighing from 100 to 1,000 pounds, using mechanical hoists and manual labor to position explosive devices beneath aircraft wings and fuselages according to specifications determined by mission planners who calculated the optimal combination of ordnance types for specific targets. Torpedo loading required even greater precision, as the aerial torpedoes carried by Devastator aircraft weighed more than 1,500 pounds each and contained enough explosive material to sink heavy cruisers if properly aimed and armed. The Hornet's flight deck operations employed approximately 312 specialized personnel organized into teams responsible for aircraft handling, ordnance loading, maintenance, and safety monitoring. Launch operations typically achieved cycle times of 90 seconds between aircraft departures, requiring coordination between catapult crews, aircraft handlers, and pilots to maintain the rapid tempo essential for getting strike groups airborne before enemy reconnaissance aircraft could report the carrier's position. The ship's 2 catapults could accelerate aircraft from 0 to flying speed within 150 feet of deck space, using steam pressure generated by the ship's power plant to provide the force necessary for launching fully loaded bombers. Aircraft recovery operations required similar precision, with landing aircraft snagged by arresting wires that could stop a speeding aircraft within 300 feet, while absorbing the tremendous kinetic energy generated by planes approaching at speeds exceeding 90 miles per hour. Safety protocols governing flight deck operations reflected hard-learned lessons from accidents that had killed experienced personnel and destroyed valuable aircraft during the early months of American involvement in the Pacific War. Standard operating procedures required that all personnel remain clear of designated safety zones around aircraft engines and propellers, areas where a moment of inattention could result in immediate death for anyone caught in the path of spinning metal. Fire prevention measures included strict controls on smoking, detailed procedures for handling aviation, gasoline during refueling operations, and immediate response protocols for dealing with fuel spills that could ignite from engine heat or electrical sparks generated by aircraft systems. The coordination between different deck crews required communication systems that functioned effectively despite the noise and confusion that characterized normal flight operations aboard the carrier. Flag signals provided visual communication between the ship's island structure and deck personnel, while colored paddles allowed landing signal officers to guide returning aircraft through the complex approach procedures necessary for safe recovery aboard the moving deck. Hand signals between crew members conveyed essential information about aircraft status, ordnance loading, and safety conditions without relying on verbal communication that became impossible when multiple aircraft engines operated simultaneously on the confined deck space. Emergency procedures address the constant possibility that equipment failures, weather conditions, or enemy action could transform routine flight operations into life-threatening situations requiring immediate responses from all deck personnel. Aircraft fire suppression systems included portable equipment that could be deployed quickly to prevent small fires from spreading to fuel tanks or ordnance storage areas where explosions could destroy the ship and kill hundreds of men. Medical personnel stationed near the flight deck could provide immediate treatment for injuries that occurred during normal operations, while damage control teams stood ready to respond to equipment failures that could disable catapults or arresting gear essential for continued flight operations. The psychological pressure experienced by flight deck personnel reflected their awareness that mistakes in aircraft handling or ordnance loading could have consequences extending far beyond individual safety to affect the success of entire combat missions. The responsibility for ensuring that aircraft launched properly with functional weapon systems created stress levels that required careful management by supervisory personnel who monitored crew performance for signs of fatigue or distraction that could lead to accidents. Training programs emphasize the development of automatic responses to emergency situations, enabling deck crews to react appropriately to crisis situations without depending on complex decision-making processes that might fail under the extreme pressure of combat operations. The innovation required for effective deck operations led to the development of procedures and equipment modifications that improved efficiency while maintaining safety standards essential for preserving human life and expensive aircraft. Deck crews developed techniques for reducing aircraft servicing time, enabling faster turnaround between missions that increased the number of sorties the Hornet could launch during critical combat operations. Loading procedures for different types of ordnance became standardized to minimize confusion and reduce the time required to prepare aircraft for specific mission profiles. Whether attacking enemy ships, bombing industrial targets, or providing air support for ground forces. The integration of flight deck operations with other ship systems required constant coordination between aviation personnel and the engineering crews who maintained the steam catapults, arresting gear, and electrical systems that powered the complex machinery essential for launching and recovering aircraft. The timing of launch operations had to accommodate the ship's navigation requirements, ensuring that the carrier maintained proper heading and speed for safe aircraft operations, while avoiding exposure to enemy submarines or surface vessels that could attack the ship during the vulnerable periods when flight operations prevented rapid maneuvering. The transformation of the Hornet's flight deck from a peaceful steel platform into a launching point for America's aerial assault against Japanese forces represented one of the most complex logistical achievements of the Pacific War, requiring the coordination of hundreds of men whose individual expertise combined to create a weapon system capable of projecting American military power across thousands of miles of ocean. The success of these operations directly determined the carrier's effectiveness in combat, making the flight deck crews as essential to victory as the pilots who flew the missions and the officers who planned the strategy that would ultimately defeat the Japanese Empire. The morning of April 18, 1942, witnessed the transformation of military aviation theory into desperate reality as 16 North American B-25 Mitchell bombers prepared for launch from the Hornet's flight deck in an operation that defied every established principle of naval aviation. The sight of Army Air Force's medium bombers lashed to a Navy aircraft carrier represented the convergence of strategic necessity and tactical innovation, born from the aftermath of Pearl Harbor and President Franklin Roosevelt's demand for immediate retaliation against the Japanese homeland. The conceptual audacity of launching twin-engine land-based bombers from a carrier deck had originated with Navy Captain Francis Lowe, whose observation of B-25 aircraft at Norfolk Naval Air Station in January 1942 sparked the realization that Army bombers might possess sufficient performance characteristics to achieve takeoff from the abbreviated runway of a carrier flight deck. The selection of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle to lead the mission represented the military's recognition that this unprecedented operation required an aviator whose combination of technical expertise, leadership experience, and personal courage could overcome the substantial challenges inherent in adapting land-based aircraft for carrier operations. Doolittle's reputation as one of America's most accomplished test pilots, combined with his advanced understanding of aeronautical engineering, made him uniquely qualified to develop the procedures and modifications necessary for launching heavily loaded bombers from a platform never designed for such aircraft. His personal decision to lead the first takeoff demonstrated the leadership principle that commanders should never ask subordinates to undertake risks they would not accept themselves, establishing credibility with the volunteer crews who understood the experimental nature of their mission. The extensive modifications required to adapt B-25B Mitchell bombers for the carrier launch and subsequent long-range mission to Japan involved engineering changes that pushed the aircraft beyond their original design parameters while maintaining structural integrity essential for combat operations. Additional fuel tanks installed throughout the aircraft nearly doubled normal fuel capacity, extending range to approximately 2,400 nautical miles while reducing bomb load capacity to accommodate the weight of extra gasoline required for the extended flight profile. The removal of the lower gun turret and other non-essential equipment reduced aircraft weight while maintaining defensive armament sufficient for the mission profile, which called for low-altitude penetration of Japanese airspace to minimize interception by enemy fighters. The strategic planning for the raid required coordination between Navy and Army Air Forces personnel, who had never previously attempted joint operations of such complexity, necessitating the development of new procedures for integrating land-based aircraft operations with carrier task force movements. The original plan called for launching the bombers approximately 400 nautical miles from the Japanese coast, allowing sufficient fuel reserves for the aircraft to reach designated landing fields in China after completing their bombing runs over Japanese cities. The selection of targets reflected both military significance and psychological impact, with planners choosing industrial facilities, military installations, and government buildings that would demonstrate American capability to strike the Japanese homeland, while avoiding purely civilian targets that might generate negative international reaction. The physical challenges of loading 16 B-25 bombers onto the Hornet's flight deck required innovative solutions for securing aircraft that were significantly larger than any previously operated from carrier decks. The bombers measured 52 feet in length with 67-foot wingspans, dimensions that left minimal clearance between aircraft when positioned for takeoff operations. Specialized tie-down equipment and deck modifications ensured that the aircraft could withstand the stresses imposed by carrier operations in heavy seas without breaking loose and potentially damaging other aircraft or flight deck equipment. The positioning of aircraft in precise launch sequence eliminated the possibility of rearranging takeoff order once operations commenced, requiring careful planning to ensure that Doolittle's aircraft occupied the forward position, despite being the mission commander. The Task Force 16 composition included the carriers Hornet and Enterprise, the cruisers Nashville, Vincennes, Northampton, and Salt Lake City, 8 destroyers, and 2 fleet oilers, representing a significant commitment of naval resources for an operation whose success depended upon achieving complete tactical surprise. The task force departed San Francisco on April 2, 1942, maintaining strict radio silence during the approach to Japanese waters to prevent enemy intelligence services from detecting the unusual concentration of American naval forces moving toward the Japanese homeland. The 16 B-25 bombers occupied the entire aft portion of Hornet's flight deck, making normal flight operations impossible and forcing the carrier to rely upon Enterprise for air cover during the approach to the launch position. The early morning encounter with Japanese picket vessel Nida Maru at approximately 07:38 hours on April 18th forced Admiral William Halsey to abandon the original launch plan and order immediate takeoff operations while still 650 nautical miles from the Japanese coast. The decision to launch early sacrificed the safety margin that would have allowed the bombers to reach Chinese airfields, virtually guaranteeing that most crews would be forced to bail out over Japanese-occupied territory or attempt crash landings in areas where rescue seemed unlikely. The rapid destruction of Nida Maru by gunfire from USS Nashville prevented the picket vessel from transmitting detailed information about American force composition, but radio intercepts confirmed that some warning had reached Japanese naval headquarters. The launch sequence commenced at AOEI 20 hours, with Doolittle's B-25 successfully becoming airborne despite heavy seas that caused the Hornet's flight deck to pitch dramatically as each bomber began its takeoff roll. The flight deck crew's precise timing of launch operations required split-second coordination to ensure that aircraft began takeoff runs during the upward pitch of the carrier's bow, maximizing the relative wind velocity essential for achieving flying speed within the limited deck space available. Each subsequent launch built upon the successful precedent established by Doolittle's takeoff, demonstrating to remaining crews that the seemingly impossible operation could be accomplished through skill and determination. The psychological impact of the Doolittle raid extended far beyond the limited physical damage inflicted upon Japanese industrial targets, representing the first American offensive action against the Japanese homeland and proving that Japan's defensive perimeter could be penetrated by American forces. The raid forced Japanese military leaders to retain significant air defense assets in the home islands that might otherwise have been deployed to support offensive operations in the Pacific, representing a strategic victory that exceeded the tactical importance of the targets actually destroyed. The boost to American morale provided by news of the successful raid proved invaluable during the dark early months of American involvement in the Pacific War, when military defeats and territorial losses had created widespread pessimism about America's ability to defeat Japanese forces. The innovative aspects of the Doolittle raid established precedents for joint service operations that would become increasingly important as the war progressed, and American military strategy required coordination between Army, Navy, and Marine Corps forces across multiple theaters of operation. The successful adaptation of land-based aircraft for carrier operations demonstrated the potential for creative solutions to overcome apparent limitations imposed by existing equipment and established procedures. The mission proved that American industrial capacity and technical expertise could be rapidly mobilized to create new capabilities in response to strategic requirements that exceeded the parameters of peacetime military planning. The human cost of the operation reflected the dangerous nature of experimental military operations conducted under combat conditions, with several crew members killed during emergency landings in China and others captured by Japanese forces who executed some prisoners in violation of international law. The survival of most crew members, despite being forced to abandon their aircraft in hostile territory, demonstrated both the courage of individual airmen and the assistance provided by Chinese civilians who risked their lives to help American personnel escape Japanese occupation forces. The long-term strategic consequences of the raid included Japanese retaliation against Chinese civilians who had aided American airmen, resulting in estimated casualties exceeding 250,000. People in areas where Doolittle's crews had sought refuge after their aircraft ran out of fuel. The dawn of October 26, 1942, broke clear and calm over the Coral Sea as the Hornet steamed northwest of the Santa Cruz Islands, her flight deck crowded with aircraft, preparing for what would become the carrier's final contribution to American victory in the Pacific. The irony of perfect flying weather for the last day of the ship's existence was not lost on the experienced aviators who understood that such conditions favored both American strike operations and Japanese retaliation against the task force. Captain Charles Mason's voice carried across the ship's communication system as he announced the morning's mission objectives. Unaware that Japanese Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier strike force was already launching coordinated attacks designed to eliminate American naval power in the Solomon Islands campaign. The tactical situation that morning reflected the desperate nature of the Guadalcanal struggle, where control of Henderson Field depended upon the ability of American naval forces to prevent Japanese reinforcement and resupply operations that could overwhelm the outnumbered Marine defenders holding the airfield. The Japanese attack developed with the precision and overwhelming force that characterized their naval aviation at its peak effectiveness. demonstrating the tactical expertise that had made the Imperial Japanese Navy the dominant carrier force in the Pacific during the war's opening months. The first wave of attacking aircraft approached the American task force from multiple directions, employing coordinated dive bomber and torpedo plane attacks that saturated defensive systems and overwhelmed the anti-aircraft batteries protecting the carriers. The initial bombing runs scored direct hits on the Hornet's flight deck and hangar areas, starting fires that spread rapidly among parked aircraft loaded with fuel and ordnance for the morning strike, missions against Japanese positions. The catastrophic damage inflicted during the opening minutes of the attack demonstrated the vulnerability of aircraft carriers to concentrated air assault, as even the most advanced damage control systems could not contain the explosive forces unleashed when aviation gasoline and bomb storage areas were penetrated by enemy ordnance. The first bomb hit forward of the island structure, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar bay among assembled aircraft, creating a chain reaction of secondary explosions that killed dozens of aviation personnel and destroyed millions of dollars worth of irreplaceable equipment. The second bomb strike occurred near the after elevator, jamming the mechanism and preventing the movement of damaged aircraft below decks, where fires might have been contained more effectively. The torpedo attacks that followed the initial bombing demonstrated the deadly effectiveness of Japanese aerial torpedo tactics, with Nakajima B-5N Kate aircraft approaching at wave-top altitude to launch weapons that could penetrate the carrier's armored belt below the waterline. The first torpedo struck the port side amidships, flooding engineering spaces and causing an immediate loss of power that disabled damage control pumps essential for fighting the spreading fires throughout the ship. The second torpedo impact created additional flooding that caused the Hornet to develop a pronounced list to port, complicating firefighting efforts and making it increasingly difficult for damage control teams to move equipment through compartments that were filling with seawater and smoke. The coordinated nature of Japanese air attacks overwhelmed the defensive capabilities of the task force escort vessels, whose anti-aircraft batteries could not provide sufficient protection against the number of attacking aircraft approaching from multiple directions simultaneously. The battleship South Dakota and cruisers positioned around the carriers fired continuously at Japanese aircraft, shooting down several attackers but unable to prevent determined pilots from pressing home their attacks against the valuable carrier targets. The effectiveness of Japanese tactics reflected months of combat experience gained during operations in the Southwest Pacific, where Imperial Navy pilots had refined techniques for attacking heavily defended naval formations. The Battle of Santa Cruz Islands witnessed the collision of two carrier forces at the peak of their tactical development, with experienced air crews on both sides employing the most advanced aircraft and weapons available to their respective nations. The Hornet's Air Group managed to launch strike aircraft despite the damage sustained during the initial attacks, with surviving pilots joining Enterprise aircraft in attacks against Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuiho that inflicted significant damage on the enemy force. The American strike operations demonstrated the resilience of carrier aviation even under the most challenging circumstances, as pilots continued to execute their missions despite knowing that their home carrier was under devastating attack. The human cost of the morning's attacks became apparent as damage control teams worked desperately to contain fires that threatened to consume the entire ship, while rescue operations attempted to evacuate wounded personnel from compartments filled with smoke and toxic fumes. Aviation ordnancemen who had loaded bombs and torpedoes for the morning strike mission found themselves fighting fires among the same weapons they had prepared for use against Japanese targets. The ship's medical facilities quickly became overwhelmed with casualties as corpsmen and medical officers treated burns, blast injuries, and smoke inhalation cases, while the ship continued to suffer additional attacks throughout the morning. The decision to abandon ship reflected the professional judgment of experienced naval officers who recognized that the Hornet had sustained damage beyond the capability of her crew to repair while under combat conditions. Captain Mason's order to prepare for abandonment came only after damage control efforts had failed to contain the spreading fires and progressive flooding that threatened the ship's stability. The evacuation procedures developed through peacetime training proved inadequate for the reality of abandoning a burning carrier under enemy attack, requiring improvisation and courage from crew members who worked to save their shipmates while Japanese aircraft continued to strafe the listing vessel. The final phase of the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands demonstrated both the limitations and the desperate courage that characterized naval warfare in the Pacific theater, where individual acts of heroism occurred within the context of technological destruction that exceeded anything previously experienced in naval combat. The attacking Japanese aircraft faced increasingly desperate defensive fire from the Hornet's remaining anti-aircraft batteries, which continued to engage enemy targets even as flames consumed much of the ship around the gun positions. The sight of a burning aircraft carrier defending herself to the last moment became an enduring symbol of American determination to continue fighting regardless of the tactical situation. The statistical reality of the Hornet's final battle reflected the deadly mathematics of carrier warfare, where a few successful attacks could destroy years of construction effort and trained personnel essential for prosecuting naval campaigns. The battle resulted in 6 direct bomb hits and 2 torpedo strikes against the Hornet, causing damage that proved beyond repair despite the efforts of trained damage control teams. The attack killed 111 crew members and wounded 108 others, while 2,381 survivors were successfully rescued by escort vessels that risked additional attacks to save their shipmates. The ship burned throughout October 26 before finally sinking during the early hours of October 27, 1942, taking with her the accumulated experience and equipment that represented America's investment in naval aviation technology. The strategic consequences of the Hornet's loss extended beyond the immediate tactical situation in the Solomon Islands, demonstrating to both American and Japanese leadership the enormous costs associated with carrier warfare in the confined waters of the Southwest Pacific. The destruction of the last American fleet carrier available for operations in the South Pacific left only the damaged Enterprise to provide air cover for Allied ground forces holding Guadalcanal, creating a critical shortage of naval aviation assets at the moment when Japanese forces were making their maximum effort to recapture Henderson Field. The loss forced American commanders to adopt more conservative tactical approaches that limited offensive operations while waiting for replacement carriers to arrive from American shipyards. The final hours of the Hornet embodied the transformation of naval warfare that characterized the Pacific conflict, where technological innovation and tactical adaptation determined the outcome of battles that decided the fate of entire campaigns. The ship's service record of 1 year and 6 days represented the compressed timeline of World War II carrier operations, where vessels designed for 20-year service lives were consumed in months by the intensity of combat operations. The discovery of the Hornet's wreck in January 2019 at a depth of 7,500 feet near the Solomon Islands provided physical evidence of the violent end of America's last fleet carrier lost to enemy action, preserving in the Pacific depths the memory of 2,600 men who had transformed from civilian strangers into a fighting force capable of projecting American power across the vast expanses of the world's largest ocean.